The year was 1932. Australia faced a problem. Not a foreign invasion, not a global economic crisis. The problem was birds, big birds, emus. These large, flightless birds, native to Australia, decided to invade Western Australia's Campion district. They marched in a feathered horde, thousands strong. Farmers in the area, ex-soldiers from World War I, had just begun to harvest their wheat crops. The emus saw an easy meal. They flattened fences. They ate the grain. They ruined the fields. The farmers, already struggling in the tough economic times of the Great Depression, were desperate. They appealed to the government. They asked for help. They wanted soldiers. They wanted guns. The Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, heard their pleas. Pearce had a personal connection to the region. He represented Western Australia in the Senate. He decided to act. He saw an opportunity. He could help the farmers. He could also show the value of the military. He could demonstrate that soldiers were useful even in peacetime. Pearce sent Major G.P.W. Meredith. Meredith was an officer in the Royal Australian Artillery. He brought 2 soldiers with him, Private J. O'Halloran and Gunner S. McMurray. They brought 2 Lewis automatic machine guns. These guns fired many bullets quickly. Each gun had 10,000 rounds of ammunition. This was a lot of bullets. The plan was simple. Shoot the emus, kill them, drive them away from the farms. The soldiers arrived in the Campion district in early November. They found thousands of emus. The birds were everywhere. They roamed the wheat fields. They moved in large groups. Meredith observed the emus. He saw how they behaved. He noticed they were not stupid. They were fast. They were agile. They ran in unpredictable ways. This made them hard to hit. The first attempts at shooting the emus did not go well. The soldiers tried to herd the birds. They tried to drive them into a good position for shooting. The emus scattered. They ran in all directions. They outran the men. The Lewis guns were heavy. They were hard to aim quickly. The soldiers struggled. On November 2nd, the operation officially began. The soldiers encountered about 50 emus. They opened fire. The emus ran. Many escaped unharmed. The soldiers fired again. They hit a few birds. Not many. Meredith reported, "The emus prove that they are not as foolish as they were thought to be. The birds learned quickly. They avoided the soldiers. They scattered at the first sign of danger. The soldiers tried a new tactic. They mounted a machine gun on a truck. They hoped the truck would allow them to keep up with the birds. They could chase the emus. They could shoot them from the moving vehicle. This idea sounded good. It did not work well in practice. The roads were rough. The truck bounced and swayed. It was impossible to aim accurately. The gunner could not keep the sights on the running birds. The emus were too fast. The truck was too slow. The terrain was too difficult. The experiment failed. Days turned into weeks. The soldiers fired many bullets. They killed few emus. The official reports showed low numbers. Very low numbers. Meredith wrote to Pearce. He explained the difficulties. He said the emus were tough. They were hard to kill. He said the machine guns were not effective. The bullets did not always stop the birds. Some emus ran on after being hit. The media learned about the operation. Newspapers reported on the Emu War. They made fun of the military. They questioned the government's decision. People asked why soldiers were fighting birds. They asked about the cost. Taxpayers' money was paying for bullets. It was paying for soldiers' time. People wondered if this was a good use of resources. The public saw it as a joke, a ridiculous situation. Soldiers with machine guns fighting birds. It seemed absurd. The pressure mounted on Pearce. The laughter grew louder. He defended the operation. He said it helped the farmers. He said it showed the military's willingness to help. He said it provided training for the soldiers. But the facts were clear. The operation was not working. The emus continued to destroy crops. The soldiers continued to struggle. By mid-November, the first phase of the operation ended. The soldiers returned to their base. The official count was around 1,000 emus killed. This number was disputed. Many believed it was much lower. The soldiers had used thousands of rounds of ammunition. The cost per kill was very high. The farmers were still unhappy. The emu problem persisted. Despite the failures, the farmers continued to demand action. They wanted more help. They wanted the military to return. They believed the soldiers could still solve the problem. Pearce agreed to send Meredith and his men back. The second phase of Operation Emu began in early December. The second attempt was no more successful than the first. The emus remained elusive. They avoided the soldiers. They scattered at the sound of gunfire. The soldiers fired more bullets. They killed a few more birds. The numbers remained low. The public outcry continued. The media kept reporting on the failure. The Emu War became a symbol of government incompetence. Meredith's reports became more frustrated. He described the emus as intelligent adversaries. He said they had developed tactics. They learned to avoid the traps. They learned to avoid the soldiers. They became even harder to hunt. The soldiers tried different approaches. They tried ambushes. They tried to stalk the birds. Nothing worked consistently. The sheer number of emus overwhelmed them. The soldiers spent weeks chasing emus. They fired thousands of rounds. They achieved minimal results. The operation drew to a close in mid-December. The soldiers went home. The emus remained. They continued to eat the wheat. They continued to cause problems for the farmers. The government decided to stop the military operation. It was clear that machine guns were not the answer. The failure of Operation Emu was a clear lesson. Soldiers with machine guns were not effective against a large population of intelligent, fast-moving birds. The military learned that some problems require different solutions. The farmers learned they could not rely on the army to solve their bird problem. The emus, for their part, continued their lives. They continued to roam the Australian landscape. They continued to be a challenge for farmers. The big problem started simply enough. Farmers in Western Australia, specifically around the Campion district, had a new enemy. This enemy walked on two legs, stood taller than a man, and ate their wheat. These were emus, thousands of them. They came out of the bush, pushed by a dry season and drawn by the promise of newly planted crops. The farmers, many of them former soldiers who had just fought in the Great War, knew how to deal with problems. They asked for help. They had rifles but not enough bullets and too many birds. Australia's military leaders in 1932 heard the farmers' pleas. George Pearce, the Minister of Defence, had an idea. He thought using machine guns against the emus would solve two problems at once. It would get rid of the pests and provide target practice for soldiers. He sent in Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery. Meredith brought 2 soldiers with him and 2 Lewis automatic machine guns. Each gun held 25 rounds in a Pan magazine. They also had 10,000 rounds of ammunition. This was serious firepower for what the soldiers believed would be an easy task. The plan was simple: drive the emus into a killing zone, then open fire. The soldiers arrived in the Campion district on November 2, 1932. They saw the vast flat plains, dotted with small trees and bushes, and rows of young wheat shoots. The emus were everywhere. Major Meredith watched them, noting their speed and their habit of scattering when approached. This would prove harder than he thought. Their first attempt was a bust. They spotted a flock of about 50 emus. The soldiers set up their machine guns. A vehicle, a truck, tried to herd the birds closer. Emus, however, do not herd like sheep. They ran. They split into smaller groups, veering off in different directions. The machine gunners could not track them. The first burst of fire missed entirely. The birds simply scattered into the bush. It was a frustrating start. The soldiers packed up their guns and moved on. The next day they tried a new tactic. They found a larger group, maybe 1,000 emus. They set up an ambush near a water source. The hope was that the emus, needing to drink, would come close enough for a good shot. But the emus were wary. They approached the water cautiously. When the soldiers opened fire, the same thing happened. The birds broke formation. They ran in all directions, their long legs carrying them away at speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour. Some fell hit by the machine gun fire, but most escaped. The soldiers picked up the spent brass casings. They had used a lot of ammunition for very few kills. Major Meredith began to understand his foe. The problem was the emu's unpredictable movement. A machine gun is best used against a stationary target or a target moving in a predictable line. Emus did neither. They zigged, they zagged, they stopped, they started. Their brown feathers blended into the dry landscape. They were hard to hit, even with a stream of bullets. The soldiers tried mounting a gun on a truck. They thought they could drive alongside the birds and shoot them. This failed spectacularly. The truck, a civilian vehicle, bounced violently over the rough terrain. The gunner could not aim. He held on for dear life as the truck lurched and bucked. The emus ran smoothly, unaffected by the uneven ground. It was an impossible shot. The soldiers spent days trying different methods. They tried driving the emus into fences, hoping to funnel them into a small area. The emus simply found gaps in the fences, or in some cases ran straight through them. They were powerful birds. Their thick legs and strong bodies allowed them to break through weak points. The fences offered little resistance. The farmers watched, some with amusement, some with growing frustration. They had expected quick results. The soldiers, with their military precision and powerful weapons, were failing. Major Meredith reported back to his superiors. His early reports were not good. He admitted the emus were proving difficult targets. He wrote about their amazingly quick scattering power and their inability to be driven by humans or vehicles. He noted that each small group had its own leader, a single bird that would guide the others away from danger. Shooting this leader did not help. Another bird simply took its place. The emus had an instinctive survival strategy. The media got wind of the operation. Newspapers dubbed it the Emu War. They reported on the soldiers' struggles, often with a humorous tone. People across Australia and even overseas followed the story. It became a joke. How could a modern army armed with machine guns fail to defeat a flock of large, flightless birds? The government faced embarrassment. Minister Pearce had promised a swift victory. Now the emus seemed to be winning. By November 8th, after nearly a week of fighting, the official count was grim. Major Meredith's unit had fired approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition. They had killed, by their own estimates, around 300 emus. This meant it took more than 8 bullets to kill one bird. This was not an efficient use of ammunition. It was also not solving the farmers' problem. Thousands more emus still roamed the wheat fields. The soldiers tried night operations. They thought they could ambush the emus as they slept or gathered in large numbers. Emus, however, are not easily caught unaware. They remained alert. Any sudden light or noise sent them scattering. The darkness made accurate shooting almost impossible. Bullets flew, but the emus remained largely unharmed. The efforts continued day after day, with little to show for them. The novelty of the war wore off for the soldiers. It became tedious work, chasing birds across endless plains. The farmers still faced ruin. The emus continued to eat their crops. The young wheat shoots carefully planted disappeared into the birds' stomachs. The dry conditions meant the emus were desperate for food and water. They kept coming. The soldiers felt the pressure. Their mission was to protect the crops, and they were clearly failing. The Lewis guns, designed to mow down enemy infantry, seemed useless against these feathered foes. The gunners struggled with the constant jamming of the weapons from dust and sand. The harsh environment was as much an enemy as the birds. Public opinion turned. People began to criticize the operation. Some argued it was cruel to use machine guns on animals. Others simply found the whole affair ridiculous. Minister Pearce, facing ridicule and pressure, decided to end the operation. On November 8th, he ordered the soldiers to withdraw. The Emu War, as it was called, was over. Major Meredith and his men left the Campion district, leaving the emus to roam free. The farmers were left to deal with the problem themselves, often returning to their old methods of fencing, trapping, and individual rifle fire. The initial campaign had been an abject failure. The military, with its superior firepower, could not defeat a large population of wild birds. The emus, driven by instinct and need, had outmaneuvered the soldiers. They showed no sign of surrender. They simply continued to live, to eat, and to thrive in the harsh Australian landscape. Their resilience surprised everyone involved. The incident served as a strange lesson in the limitations of military force when applied to an unexpected enemy in an unpredictable environment. The vast numbers of the birds, their speed, and their ability to scatter made them immune to the tactics used. The soldiers had expected a simple culling operation. They got a lesson in humility. The emus, apparently, didn't read the memo about surrendering to superior firepower. They simply kept running. They showed no fear. They showed no respect for the military's intentions. They just wanted the wheat, and they took it. The soldiers tried their best, but the birds were simply too many, too fast, and too smart for the plan that had been put in place. The Lewis guns were powerful, but power alone did not guarantee victory against such an unconventional foe. The emus were rude indeed. They did not play by the rules of engagement the humans had in mind. They were just birds acting on instinct, and that instinct was to survive. And they did. This whole strategic retreat idea really threw a wrench in our plans. We thought hunting these fast, dumb birds would be easy. They're not exactly rocket scientists, right? Just fly in a straight line, let us shoot, and we'd be eating roasted fowl by dinner. Simple, except it wasn't. Not even close. The moment we fired, they exploded. Not literally, of course, but their formation just disintegrated. 1 second, a nice, predictable cluster. The next, a feathered explosion, every bird veering off in its own direction, a blur against the sky. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net. Our shots, which felt so precise a moment before, were now just punching holes in empty air. We'd calibrated for a steady target, for a predictable flight path. What we got was chaos. And chaos, it turns out, is a terrible target. We had our best marksmen out there, the ones who could hit a coin from 50 paces. They were scratching their heads, muttering under their breath. You could see the frustration building. One guy, typically calm under pressure, actually threw his rifle down in disgust. Said he felt like he was trying to herd lightning. And he wasn't wrong. The intel was supposed to be solid. Dumb birds, the scouts reported. Slow to react, predictable flight patterns. We even had detailed schematics of their typical migratory routes, their preferred feeding grounds, their nesting habits. We'd planned for every contingency, or so we thought. We had staggered firing lines, cross patterns of fire, even a few experimental sonic emitters designed to disorient them. All of it useless. The moment the first shot echoed, the birds acted like they had a collective central nervous system, all firing at once. It wasn't a panicked flight, not really. It was more like an instantaneous, intelligent dispersal. They didn't just flap randomly. They accelerated, twisted, and dove with an agility that defied their supposed dumb designation. It was as if they possessed some inherent, almost psychic understanding of projectile trajectories. They weren't just avoiding the shot, they were anticipating its path and moving before it arrived. Consider the data we collected. Our telemetry showed their initial velocity at 30 miles per hour. Within milliseconds of our first volley, that velocity spiked to 60, sometimes 70 miles per hour. Their turns, initially wide and arcing, became impossibly tight, almost 90-degree pivots in mid-air. We recorded instances of birds performing what can only be described as aerial corkscrews, diving and climbing simultaneously, making themselves virtually impossible targets. It was like watching a swarm of avian acrobats, not the simple plodding creatures we'd been led to believe. Our projectile tracking systems, state-of-the-art as they were, struggled to maintain a lock. The birds were simply too fast, too erratic. The system would acquire a target, calculate a lead, and just as the firing solution was achieved, the bird would execute an evasive maneuver that rendered the entire calculation moot. We were chasing ghosts. Our targeting algorithms, designed for predictable motion, were overwhelmed by the sheer unpredictability. The processing units, usually humming along efficiently, were overheating, trying to keep up with the real-time adjustments required. The team on the ground, the ones responsible for flushing the birds, were equally baffled. They used their usual methods: loud noises, sudden movements, even a few trained dogs. Normally, this would send the birds into a predictable upward surge. This time, however, the birds didn't just flush. They exploded upwards, outwards, and even downwards into thick underbrush, disappearing from sight in a blink. It was like they had an emergency scatter protocol hardwired into their tiny brains, a pre-programmed response to any perceived threat. We even tried to isolate smaller groups, thinking perhaps their collective intelligence waned with fewer numbers. We used nets, silent drones, even tried to lure them with bait. It made no difference. A single bird, isolated from its flock, still exhibited the same hyper-aware, hyper-agile, evasive maneuvers. It was a standalone survival mechanism, not just a flock phenomenon. This wasn't some simple flocking behavior. It was an innate individual proficiency at avoiding harm. The implications of this are significant. We weren't just dealing with a lack of marksmanship. We were facing an evolutionary adaptation that far exceeded our expectations. These dumb birds were, in fact, incredibly sophisticated survivors. Their scattering wasn't a random panic. It was a highly effective, almost instantaneous, defensive strategy. It was a masterclass in aerial evasion, executed by creatures we had utterly underestimated. We had to reassess everything: our tactical manuals, our training protocols, even our basic understanding of avian behavior. The initial assessment was wrong. These birds weren't dumb. They were incredibly good at staying alive, and we were struggling to keep up. This wasn't a hunting expedition anymore. It was a lesson in humility, and a very frustrating one at that. Emus face down every threat. They do not flinch, they do not waver. They have two tools, two perfect weapons: existential dread and the zigzag. These tools make emus unbeatable. Consider a predator. A dingo stalks. It sees an emu. The dingo moves in. The emu sees the dingo. The emu does not run straight. It runs in zigzags. The dingo struggles. The dingo tries to follow. The emu changes direction. Left, right, left, right. The dingo cannot keep up. The dingo gets tired. The dingo gives up. The emu wins. This is the zigzag in action. It is simple. It is effective. No animal runs like an emu. This makes them hard to catch. Now think about existential dread. An emu faces a challenge. Maybe a fence blocks its path. Other animals might stop. They might look for another way. Not the emu. The emu stares at the fence. It feels the vastness of existence. It understands its place in the universe. This understanding fuels it. It does not think, "I can't get over this fence." It thinks, "This fence is a temporary obstacle in an infinite cosmos." It pushes forward. It finds a way. It jumps the fence or it goes through it. The fence means nothing. The emu's will means everything. Imagine a farmer. The farmer wants to keep emus out of crops. The farmer builds a strong fence. The fence is tall. The fence is thick. The farmer watches. An emu approaches. The emu looks at the fence. The emu feels the weight of its own brief existence against the backdrop of eternity. This feeling makes the emu fearless. It sees the fence not as a barrier, but as a fleeting concept. The emu finds a weakness. It pushes. It tests. It finds a way under, or it finds a way over. The farmer's fence fails. The emu eats the crops. The emu wins. This is existential dread at work. These two weapons work together. A challenger appears. The emu runs. It zigzags. The challenger pursues. The emu does not panic. The emu understands that this pursuit is a small moment in time. It feels the dread of being, but this dread makes it stronger. It fuels the zigzags. It makes each turn sharper. It makes each movement more precise. The challenger tires. The challenger gives up. The emu continues. It knows that life goes on, regardless of the challenge. Think of an extreme situation. A bushfire rages, animals flee, they run in straight lines, they run from the fire. An emu runs, but it does not run straight. It zigzags through the smoke. It weaves around burning trees. It does not fear the fire. It acknowledges the fire's destructive power, but it also understands its impermanence. The fire will burn out. The emu will remain. This perspective, born of existential dread, allows it to navigate chaos with a cool resolve. It finds the gaps. It finds the clear paths. It escapes. Other animals perish. The emu survives. The zigzag is not just a physical movement, it is a philosophy. When an emu moves, it does not commit to a single direction. It always holds the possibility of change. This mirrors its understanding of existence. Nothing is fixed. Everything can change. A path can be altered. A threat can be evaded. This constant adaptability, powered by the zigzag, is a fundamental part of its unbeatable nature. Consider a human trying to capture an emu. The human plans. The human tries to predict the emu's movement. The human sets a trap. The emu approaches. The emu senses the trap. It does not walk into it. It does not hesitate. It feels the vastness of the world around it, and the trap becomes insignificant. It zigzags around the trap. It avoids the capture. The human fails. The emu remains free. The human's linear thinking cannot match the emu's multi-directional approach. An emu's diet is varied. It eats seeds, fruits, insects, and small animals. It ranges wide. It faces different landscapes. It encounters different challenges. Each challenge is met with the same strategy. A food source is guarded by another animal. The emu does not fight directly. It zigzags around the guard. It finds an opening. It snatches the food. The guard animal is confused. The emu wins the food. This applies to territory as well. An emu does not defend a fixed territory. It ranges. If another emu enters its space, it might engage in a zigzag dance, a display of unpredictable movement that communicates dominance without direct combat. The less agile emu retreats. The more agile, the one embracing the zigzag philosophy, claims the space. The concept of existential dread in an emu is not about fear. It is about understanding. It understands its own mortality. It understands the impermanence of all things. This understanding does not paralyze it, it liberates it. It removes the fear of failure. It removes the fear of consequence. If a venture fails, another will arise. If a threat appears, it will pass. This deep-seated knowledge allows the emu to act with a clarity of purpose that other animals lack. They are burdened by immediate concerns. The emu sees the bigger picture. Imagine a territorial dispute between two emus. They do not stand and fight like kangaroos. They begin to run. They zigzag around each other. They feint. They dodge. They create a swirling, unpredictable ballet of movement. The emu that can maintain this unpredictable pattern longer. The emu that can integrate the existential dread into its every step, making each turn a statement of its unflappable nature, wins. The other emu, unable to sustain the mental and physical agility required, breaks away. The victor remains, a testament to the power of the zigzag and the liberating force of understanding one's place in the universe. Weather conditions do not deter an emu. A strong wind blows. Other birds struggle to fly. Animals seek shelter. The emu stands. It feels the wind. It knows the wind is a temporary phenomenon. It zigzags against the wind's force. It finds purchase. It moves forward. The wind cannot stop it. A heavy rain falls. Other creatures hide. The emu walks through the rain. It zigzags around puddles. It finds higher ground. The rain is just water. It does not affect the emu's fundamental resolve. It understands the transient nature of weather. This understanding, born of existential dread, allows it to push through adversity. The zigzag is not just a defensive maneuver. It is an offensive one too. An emu approaches a thorny bush. It wants the berries. Other animals might try to go around or avoid it. The emu zigzags through the thorns. It finds the openings. It navigates the dangers. It gets to the berries. The thorns cannot stop it. The emu's ability to not commit to a straight line allows it to penetrate defenses that would halt other creatures. It does not see the thorns as a static wall, but as a series of points to be navigated. Each turn a precise adjustment. Consider human perception of emus. Humans often view emus as large, somewhat clumsy birds. This is a mistake. This misjudgment works to the emu's advantage. Humans expect straight-line flight or predictable movement. They do not expect the erratic yet controlled chaos of the zigzag. They do not expect the underlying philosophical fortitude. This element of surprise is another layer to the emu's unbeatable strategy. The opponent cannot predict what they do not understand. And humans, with their linear thinking, often fail to grasp the true nature of the emu's tactics. An emu in a crowded situation. A group of sheep grazes. An emu wants to pass. It does not push directly. It zigzags through the flock. It weaves between the sheep. The sheep are confused. They cannot anticipate its next move. The emu passes through without incident. It shows how the zigzag allows for efficient movement, even in congested areas. It is not about brute force. It is about intelligent, unpredictable navigation. The power of existential dread allows the emu to overcome pain. An emu gets a minor injury. It does not stop. It does not dwell on the pain. The eagle cannot lock on. The eagle misses. The emu continues its unpredictable movement. The eagle gives up. The emu lives. The aerial predator, designed for straight-line pursuit, is defeated by the ground-bound master of unpredictability. This constant, fluid movement, this embracing of change, is a rejection of stagnation. An emu never stays still for long. It is always exploring, always moving, always adapting. This constant motion, often in a zigzag pattern, keeps it fit. It keeps its senses sharp. It keeps it ready for any eventuality. It is a living embodiment of dynamic adaptability. The emu is a creature in perpetual motion, and that motion is rarely, if ever, a straight line. The ability to run at high speeds is one thing. The ability to change direction instantly at high speeds is another. Emus excel at the latter. Their powerful legs allow for bursts of speed, but it is the precision of their turns, the sudden shifts in momentum, that truly define their running style. This agility, combined with their understanding of the transient nature of all things, makes them elusive targets. They are not merely fast, they are fast and fundamentally unpredictable. This combination is what makes them unbeatable. They do not just run away, they disappear in plain sight, thanks to their uncopyable movements. The sky above the farmlands churned with a dark, feathered mass. For weeks the murmuration grew, a living, breathing shadow over the fields. Farmers watched, helpless, as their crops, once emerald green, turned to ragged stalks. These were not just birds, they were an airborne plague. They descended in a chaotic ballet, stripping grains, snapping fruit from branches, and leaving desolation. A deep worry etched itself onto every face in the agricultural heartland. The local militia tried simple deterrents, loud noises, scarecrows, even a few well-aimed rocks. The birds ignored it all. They flew in, ate and left, only to return with greater numbers. The problem escalated. It threatened the entire season's harvest, then next year's. People faced hunger. The regional governor grew desperate. He called for a higher authority, someone with the means to act decisively. General Armitage arrived, a man built like a granite block, his jaw set, his eyes hard. He saw the problem not as an ecological imbalance, but as a direct affront, a threat requiring a response. He toured the ravaged fields. He saw the stripped trees, the hollowed-out barns. He heard the panicked squawking, the constant rustle of wings. His aides spoke of crop rotation, biological controls, netting. Armitage listened, his face unchanging. He paced, his boots crunching on dry earth. He looked up at the endless cloud of wings. He made his assessment. "The issue is clear," General Armitage stated, his voice a low rumble. "We have an enemy. They show no regard for our land, our livelihood. We must neutralize the threat." He walked into the makeshift command post, a tent flapping in the wind. A map, crudely drawn, showed the birds' flight paths. He swept a hand across it. "This calls for a direct approach." He turned to his operations officer, Colonel Davies, a man who preferred spreadsheets to bullets. "We need more firepower, a lot more." Colonel Davies cleared his throat. "General, with respect, these are birds. They are numerous. Their movements are erratic. We lack appropriate munitions for wide-area dispersal. Our current small arms fire does little more than agitate them." Armitage slammed his fist on the rough wooden table. "Agitation? This is not a parlor game, Colonel. This is war. We have an enemy. We have ordnance. The problem is not the birds. The problem is a lack of lead. We need more bullets." His directive was blunt, unmistakable. The chain of command absorbed it. Orders spread. The military machine, built for different wars, began to pivot. Battalions received new orders. They were to deploy to the farmlands, establish firing lines, and engage the avian threat. Soldiers trained for combat against human adversaries now faced an endless sky. They drew M16s from weapon racks. They loaded magazines. Logistics officers scrambled. Ammunition supply lines designed for specific calibers and quantities strained under the sudden immense demand for small arms cartridges. Trucks, usually carrying rations or spare parts, now hauled crates of ammunition, box after box, belt after belt. The requisition forms piled up at Central Command. The first day of the campaign dawned with a mist hanging low over the fields. Squads took positions. They dug shallow scrapes in the soil, not for cover from incoming fire, but for stable firing platforms. At the command tent, General Armitage watched through binoculars. A massive wave of birds, a dark, undulating blanket, approached from the east. He gave the signal. "Commence firing!" A cacophony erupted. Thousands of rifles discharged. The crackle of gunfire ripped across the quiet countryside. Spent shell casings, gleaming brass, rained onto the churned earth. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Birds fell, their tiny bodies tumbling from the sky like dark leaves. A few landed near the soldiers, feathers ruffled, life extinguished. But for every bird that fell, 10 more flew past. The flock simply absorbed the losses, a liquid mass flowing around the bursts of fire. "Keep firing!" Sergeant Miller shouted, his voice hoarse over the din. His squad, faces grim, kept pulling triggers. Their barrels grew hot, sweat beaded on their foreheads. The recoil jarred their shoulders. They fired until their magazines emptied, then fumbled for fresh ones, their fingers sticky with grit and grime. The birds kept coming. The sound of their wings, once a gentle flutter, became a mocking roar over the incessant gunfire. The sheer scale of the avian force dwarfed the human effort. The ammunition expenditure was staggering. Daily reports flooded back to the command post. Tens of thousands of rounds, then hundreds of thousands, millions. The numbers meant little to Armitage. He saw only progress in the body count, however small relative to the remaining population. "We are making an impact," he declared, ignoring the weary expressions of his staff. "The numbers prove it. We simply need to intensify the effort. More bullets." The fields, once just agricultural land, transformed into a desolate war zone. Trees, stripped bare by birds, now bore the marks of stray bullets. Branches splintered, bark shredded. The ground was littered with spent casings, empty ammunition boxes, and the small, still forms of fallen birds. Not only the target birds, but also sparrows, robins, and other local fowl, caught in the indiscriminate spray of lead. The ecosystem suffered. Insects, once controlled by native bird populations, began to proliferate. The farmers, who had hoped for salvation, watched in dismay. The soldiers protected no crops. The firing lines trampled them into the dust. The campaign continued for weeks. Days blended into a monotonous cycle of firing, reloading, and listening to the unending squawk and flap. Soldiers spoke little. Their eyes held a distant look. They grew tired. Their shoulders ached. Their fingers blistered from the constant friction of the rifle. Morale dropped like a stone. What was the objective? What was the gain? The enemy was everywhere, yet nowhere. The birds were not a conventional foe. They had no command structure, no front lines. They simply existed and they ate. One morning, a reconnaissance drone flew over the main staging area. Its camera transmitted images back to Armitage's tent. The footage showed the damage, not just the birds, but the land itself. A vast swath of farmland resembled a lunar landscape, scarred by gunfire, barren. The drone then followed a massive flock of birds. They simply shifted their feeding grounds, moving to adjacent, undamaged fields, unperturbed by the distant crackle of fire. The strategy of attrition had failed. "General," Colonel Davies began, holding the drone footage. "They adapt. They shift. We deplete our inventory, yet the problem remains. The cost in material is astronomical. We face critical shortages in our general armories now, and the farmers report that the insects, unchecked, now pose an even greater threat to what little crop remains." Armitage watched the screen, his face unreadable. He saw the shifting flocks, the desolate earth. He drew a deep breath. "Then we expand the area of operations," he said, his voice flat. They fired out of habit, out of desperation, until their shoulders bruised and their ears rang with the metallic clang of hot brass. The regional governor made an emergency visit. He saw the devastation. He saw the weary soldiers. He saw the empty ammunition crates piled higher than the command tent. He saw the few remaining farmers trying to salvage tiny patches of withered produce. He looked at the general, his face a mask of disbelief. "General," he pleaded, "there is nothing left to save. The land, the economy, it is destroyed." General Armitage stood firm, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where a distant, dark cloud of birds still promised an unending aerial assault. "We have not yet achieved overmatch," he stated, his voice unwavering. "The enemy still moves. We need to escalate. We need to intensify the barrage. The solution is simple. The problem is a lack of lead. We need more bullets." The sun set, casting long shadows across the bullet-scarred fields, as the first stars appeared through a sky still filled with the faint, persistent echoes of a war that had no end. The general's plan, born of a simple, logical assumption that more firepower equals more control, had collided with the complex, unpredictable reality of the natural world. The military units withdrew. The machine guns fell silent. The heavy trucks lumbered away, leaving behind the dust and the farmers. Hope, once briefly rekindled by the sight of soldiers and their powerful weapons, now flickered and died. The farmers looked out at their fields. The emus remained. They strutted through the wheat, tall, defiant, their numbers seemingly untouched. The very ground seemed to vibrate with their presence. For the farmers, the war was far from over. It had merely shifted from a public spectacle to a private, grinding despair. The situation grew more desperate. The emus continued their systematic destruction. They did not just eat the wheat, they broke down fences, allowing feral rabbits and other pests into the fields. A farmer would spend a full day repairing a section of fence, only to find it flattened the next morning. The birds moved with a singular purpose, driven by instinct, by the promise of easy food. They did not understand property lines or agricultural investments. They saw only nourishment. Imagine a farmer worn by the sun and endless labor. He walks his boundary, surveying the damage. A section of wire, painstakingly repaired just yesterday, now lies twisted on the ground. Beyond it, a wave of emus moves through his ripening crop, their heads dipping, bills tearing at the valuable grain. He picks up a stone, throws it. The emus scatter, then regroup, their large, unblinking eyes seeming to mock his efforts. His rifle hangs heavy in his hand, but he knows a single weapon or even a few are useless against thousands. He feels a deep sense of powerlessness. The land that was supposed to secure his future now felt like a battleground he was losing. The government, particularly Minister Sir George Pearce, faced increasing pressure. The public, initially amused by the Emu War, now saw the operation as a costly farce. Newspapers, both local and international, ran stories that painted the Australian military as inept, unable to defeat a flock of birds. The cost of ammunition, the fuel for the trucks, the wages for the soldiers, all had been spent for negligible results. Pearce defended the initial intervention, citing the severe economic hardship faced by the soldier settlers, but the facts spoke for themselves. The military campaign had failed. The farmers tried their own methods. They strung up scarecrows, but the emus quickly learned these inert figures posed no threat. They drove their trucks, honking horns, trying to frighten the birds away. The emus would run for a short distance, then simply turn around and resume feeding. The solution could not involve large-scale conventional military tactics. It had to be something that empowered the farmers, leveraged their local knowledge, and was sustainable. The idea of a bounty system gained traction. This was not a new concept in Australia. Bounties had been paid for pests like dingoes and kangaroos for years. The logic was simple. pay the farmers directly for each emu killed. This would incentivize them to protect their own crops, turning the victims into the hunters. The government would subsidize the effort, taking the financial burden off the struggling settlers. The details were worked out. The bounty was set at $1 per emu. To claim the bounty, farmers or local shooters had to present evidence of a kill, usually a pair of emu legs or a scalp, to an authorized official at a local government office. This verification process ensured that payments were made for actual kills, and not just for expended ammunition. The bounty system began. This marked a significant shift in the Great Emu War. It was no longer a formal military operation with machine guns and strategies designed for human warfare. It became a decentralized, ongoing struggle waged by individual farmers and local hunters. They used their own rifles, shotguns, and sometimes even dogs. They knew the land, the best places to ambush the birds, the times they came to water, the routes they traveled. Consider a farmer, Mr. Jones, who had lost half his wheat crop to the emus. He now saw the birds not just as a destructive force, but as a potential source of income. He would rise before dawn, his old .303 rifle in hand. He would track the emus to their feeding grounds. He would wait patiently, sometimes for hours, for a good shot. He knew the wind direction, how to approach without being seen, where the emus would likely run. When he took down an emu, he would collect the required proof and later present it for his shilling. It was hard work, a constant low-level conflict, but it was effective. The bounty system worked for several reasons. Firstly, it placed the responsibility and the incentive directly on the people most affected. The farmers had a vested interest in protecting their crops. Secondly, it allowed for flexibility. Farmers could hunt when and where the emus were most problematic. They were not bound by military schedules or large-scale logistical constraints. Thirdly, it leveraged existing skills. Many farmers were already experienced hunters, having grown up in the bush. They understood the local fauna. The kill rates under the bounty system significantly surpassed the military's efforts. While precise overall numbers are hard to pin down, thousands upon thousands of emus were culled in the following months and years. The steady pressure from individual hunters, combined with seasonal factors, began to bring the emu population in the affected farming districts under control. It was not an overnight victory, but a slow, grinding attrition. The threat to the wheat crops, while not entirely eliminated, was greatly reduced. Farmers could finally see a pathway to sustainable agriculture. The emus, of course, were oblivious to these human policies and shifting tactics. They continued their ancient migration, driven by the search for food and water. They adapted, learning to avoid certain areas, becoming warier of human presence. But the bounty system presented a continuous, pervasive threat they could not evade. It was not a grand battle, but 1,000 small skirmishes day in and day out. The Great Emu War faded from the front pages. The military moved on to other concerns. The bruised egos and shattered illusions of military dominance slowly began to heal, but the lesson remained. Sometimes the most sophisticated tools and strategies are useless against the simplest of adversaries, especially when that adversary operates entirely outside the realm of human logic, driven only by the imperatives of nature. The true victory, if one could call it that, came not from overwhelming force, but from adapting to the problem, incentivizing a decentralized solution, and allowing the farmers to fight their own battles on their own terms. Emu casualties. Some, but nowhere near enough to call it a win. The birds were just too good at being emus. The Australian soldiers, armed with machine guns, found their targets frustratingly effective. Emus moved with incredible speed. Their long, powerful legs drove them across the ground at speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour. When a machine gun opened fire, the emus did not run in a neat, predictable line. They scattered, they weaved, they zigzagged. One moment a bird was directly in the sights, the next it had vanished from the target area, a blur of brown feathers and dust. Their bodies also posed a challenge. An emu stood tall, but its vital organs were not always easy to hit. A thick layer of feathers covered its body. These feathers, while not armor, could absorb some impact, or at least distort the path of a bullet slightly. Their bone structure, though not heavy, was resilient. Soldiers found they often needed multiple hits to bring an emu down. A single bullet, unless it struck a critical area, might not stop the bird. It might only make it run faster, adding to the soldier's frustration. Consider a soldier, sweating under the Australian sun, his finger on the trigger of a Lewis gun. A mob of emus, perhaps 100 strong, streams across the plain towards his position. He sights the lead bird. He presses the trigger. The gun chatters. Bullets rip into the earth in front of the emus, kicking up plumes of dirt. A few birds at the front stumble. Perhaps one falls. The rest, however, do not stop. They simply fan out. Some veer sharply left, others cut right. The main body of the group flows around the immediate danger zone. The soldier swings the gun, trying to track them, but their movements are too erratic. He fires another burst, then another. More dust flies. More birds scatter. He empties the drum of ammunition. When the gun falls silent, dozens of emus continue their run, disappearing into the distance, their numbers seemingly undiminished. The ground around the gun position shows many bullet holes, but the tally of dead emus on the ground remains low. The sheer numbers of the emus presented an overwhelming problem. The military operation aimed to cull perhaps 1,000 birds. Reports suggested 20,000 emus or more migrated through the wheat-growing districts. Even if the soldiers managed to kill 1,000, 19,000 remained. It was like trying to empty a lake with a bucket while a river continued to flow into it. The emus' migratory patterns, driven by ancient instincts for food and water, meant that new waves of birds constantly arrived. They followed rainfall, moving from one area to another as vegetation changed. The farmers' wheat fields, lush and green, became an irresistible magnet in the dry landscape. The emus did not possess human intelligence or tactical thought. They acted purely on instinct. This made them difficult to predict, but also impossible to deter through fear or strategy. They did not understand the concept of a front line or a safe zone. If bullets flew, they ran. If the immediate threat passed, they returned to feeding. Their survival was based on simple, direct reactions to immediate stimuli. When the soldiers mounted machine guns on trucks, they hoped to gain an advantage in speed. But the emus often outmaneuvered the vehicles. The land was not flat and smooth. It had ruts, bumps, and hidden obstacles. A truck speeding over this terrain bounced and lurched. The gunner, holding onto the heavy weapon, found it impossible to aim accurately. The emus, on their long legs, could navigate the rough ground with ease, running through bushes, darting between trees, or suddenly changing direction. The truck would churn dust trying to keep pace, but the emus proved too agile. They would disappear into the scrub, leaving the frustrated soldiers behind. Imagine the perspective from the truck. The vehicle jolts over a series of humps. The gunner, clutching the machine gun, is thrown forward, then back. His vision blurs. Ahead, a small group of emus sprint, their gangly legs a blur of motion. He tries to line up a shot, but the bouncing truck makes the gun barrel dance wildly. He fires a burst. The bullets spray high, then low, then far to the left. The emus, hearing the noise, perhaps feeling the air disturbance from the bullets, simply increase their pace, flowing away like water. They do not look back. They continue their simple, effective evasion. Even when the bounty system came into effect, and individual farmers hunted the emus with their own rifles and shotguns, the birds remained a formidable challenge. A farmer, moving on foot, might spend hours stalking a small group of emus. He needed to get close enough for a clean shot, but emus possessed keen eyesight and hearing. They sensed danger, a snapping twig, a sudden movement, a change in wind direction carrying human scent. Any of these could send the birds bolting. The farmer would take a shot, perhaps downing 1 or 2 birds, but the rest of the mob would scatter, melting into the vast landscape. The hunter then faced the task of tracking them down again, or finding another group. It was a constant, exhausting effort, a testament to the emu's natural survival abilities. The environment itself acted as an ally to the emus. The vastness of the Australian bush provided endless places for them to hide. Thick scrub, dry creek beds, and undulating terrain offered cover from human hunters. The harsh climate, with its intense heat and sudden downpours, affected the human attackers more than the native birds. Emus were adapted to these conditions. They could find water in unexpected places, and they could travel long distances without it. They belonged to the land in a way the human settlers, with their crops and fences, did not. The win that the military sought was total control, the complete eradication of the emu threat from the wheat fields. This was an impossible goal against an adversary that simply existed, following its natural course. The emus were not organized. They had no leaders, no strategy meetings, no supply lines to cut. They were a force of nature. Their defense was their very existence, their numbers, their speed, their resilience, their ability to scatter and disappear into the landscape, and their endless instinct-driven pursuit of food. The human effort, despite its advanced weapons and organized approach, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its opponent. It was not a conventional war against an army. It was an attempt to control a natural phenomenon. The emus were too fast to catch, too numerous to significantly reduce, and too instinct-driven to deter. Their success lay in their inability to be anything other than emus. They simply did what emus do, and in doing so, they defeated the military campaign. Their survival was a testament to their deep adaptation to the Australian environment, an adaptation that human technology and strategy could not overcome. The few casualties they suffered were a small price for maintaining their ancient dominance over the land. The aftermath. Australia officially lost to a bunch of flightless avians. Let that sink in. The news spread, first through Australian newspapers, then across the globe. Headlines blared. Cartoons appeared in local papers showing tall, ridiculous birds outsmarting helmeted soldiers. The world watched and it laughed. A modern army, fresh from the Great War, equipped with machine guns and disciplined men, could not defeat emus. This simple fact resonated. It created a strange kind of absurdity. The Australian government, still trying to find its footing on the international stage, found itself the subject of widespread ridicule. Public opinion, initially supportive of the farmers' plight, shifted towards wry amusement, then outright criticism of the military's bungled operation. People asked how such a thing could happen. They questioned the competence of those who ordered the deployment. The Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, already facing a challenging economic climate, now carried the burden of the Emu War failure. He had personally authorized the use of military assets. He had put his faith in firepower. That faith now lay shattered, exposed by the very birds it aimed to control. In parliamentary sessions, members of the opposition did not hesitate to press the issue. They demanded explanations. They questioned the cost of the ammunition, the fuel, the soldiers' time. They pointed to the meager results. Pearce stood his ground, maintaining the government's commitment to the soldier settlers. He spoke of the severe damage to the wheat crops, the economic hardship, but his words rang hollow against the backdrop of the widely publicized defeat. The image of the Australian military struggling against birds stuck. It was a bruise on the national ego, a visible crack in the illusion of human control over nature. Within the military ranks, the aftermath held different weight. Major G.P.W. Meredith, who led the small force, had witnessed the futility firsthand. He had seen his well-trained men, equipped with powerful weapons, rendered ineffective by the sheer unpredictability of their targets. He had directed the firing, observed the missed shots, counted the few fallen birds against the thousands of rounds expended. He understood the practical limitations. The machine guns designed to engage enemy soldiers on battlefields simply did not work against fast-moving, scattering birds on open plains. Imagine a meeting of military officers after the withdrawal. They sit around a plain table, the reports laid out. The numbers confirm the disastrous efficiency. The kill ratios are a joke. One officer might gesture at a map of the Campion district. There is no anger, only a quiet, grudging acceptance of a baffling defeat. They had learned a harsh lesson. Not every problem lends itself to a military solution. Not every foe can be conquered with lead. The very idea of military dominance, built on power and strategy, proved fragile when pitted against instinct and raw, unthinking nature. The farmers, still living with the emu problem, had to adapt. The military intervention came and went. The public mockery subsided. The government moved on to more practical solutions. The bounty system became the new, grinding reality. This meant the farmers themselves became the frontline soldiers in their ongoing war with the birds. They could no longer rely on external help or wait for another large-scale military deployment. The fight was theirs. Consider a farmer, Mr. Campbell, who had seen his neighbor's wheat decimated. He had initially supported the military's arrival, then watched their failure. Now, with the bounty system in place, he picked up his old rifle, a civilian hunting weapon. He knew the land. He knew the habits of the emus that frequented his property. He understood the need for patience, for stealth. He would rise before dawn, check the wind, and move quietly through the bush, searching for the birds. He would wait for the right moment, for a single, clear shot. He learned to track. He learned to identify the most damaging groups. Each emu he brought down meant a shilling, a small but important payment that helped offset his losses. It was a never-ending cycle, a constant vigilance against a persistent threat. The bounty system, while more effective than the machine guns, did not lead to the emu's eradication. It was a strategy of management, of control, not conquest. Emus continued their migratory patterns, driven by the seasons and the availability of food. New groups would pass through the farming districts. Farmers continued their efforts year after year, a low-intensity conflict that became part of the rhythm of agricultural life in Western Australia. The presence of the large, flightless birds remained a constant, sometimes costly factor for those trying to coax crops from the marginal land. The birds themselves, the victorious adversaries, simply continued their lives. They grazed, they migrated, they bred. They did not understand human concepts of war or defeat. Their actions were purely instinctual. They ran when startled. They scattered when shot at. They sought food where they found it. Their survival proved their fitness, their perfect adaptation to the harsh Australian environment. The war was a human construct. For the emus, it was just another part of their struggle for existence. They simply continued being emus, and that was enough to confound and defeat the military might of a nation. The Great Emu War became a peculiar footnote in military history, a story told with a shake of the head and a wry smile. It taught a clear, if humbling, lesson. Modern weaponry, military training, and human ingenuity, while powerful, held limits. Some adversaries, like the emu, did not conform to battlefield logic. They did not stand and fight. They did not break formation. They simply ran, scattered, absorbed punishment, and reappeared, their numbers too vast, their instincts too strong. Australia's loss was not a strategic defeat in a conventional sense. It was a blunt demonstration that nature, in its simple, persistent way, can sometimes resist human efforts at control with unexpected and undeniable force. Lessons learned: don't declare war on nature, or at least bring a bigger net. The Australian military brass, the politicians in Canberra, and even the determined farmers all took home a very clear lesson from the Emu War. You do not declare war on nature itself. Nature, in its raw, unthinking form, does not recognize ceasefires, peace treaties, or rules of engagement. It simply exists, acts on instinct, and follows its own course. The military machine designed for human conflict proved useless against this kind of adversary. The soldiers, initially confident in their Lewis guns, learned quickly. Their weapons fired bullets. The bullets designed to stop a human soldier had little effect on a fast-moving, scattering emu unless they hit a vital spot. And hitting a vital spot on a bird running at 50 kilometers per hour, weaving and bobbing, proved almost impossible with a heavy, automatic weapon. The soldiers found themselves firing vast quantities of ammunition into the air, into the ground, everywhere but consistently into the emus. Imagine Major Meredith watching his men. They sighted a mob, they fired. Dust exploded around the birds. A few might fall. The rest broke ranks, a dark, feathered wave splitting into smaller currents, flowing around the danger. The gunners swung their weapons, trying to track. The metal of the guns grew hot, the air filled with the sharp smell of cordite, but the emus kept moving. They disappeared into the sparse scrub or ran over a rise, only to reappear moments later, seemingly unharmed, already feeding on another patch of wheat. The soldiers had trained for enemies who held ground, enemies who advanced, enemies who retreated in predictable ways. Emus did none of these things. They simply ran. Their defense was their movement. Their strength was their lack of human logic. The terrain itself became an unexpected ally for the emus. The vast wheat fields were not billiard tables. They held dips, rises, clumps of saltbush, and areas of soft, treacherous soil. When the soldiers mounted machine guns on trucks, they believed speed would give them the advantage. Instead, the trucks bounced, lurched, and got stuck. The gunner, struggling to keep his balance, could not aim his weapon. The emus, light-footed and agile, navigated the rough ground with ease. They could sprint into thickets where the trucks could not follow. They could disappear behind a small rise in the ground in seconds. The very land the farmers tried to cultivate became a shield for the birds. The scale of the problem also taught a harsh lesson. The military force, though armed, was small. The emu population was enormous. Estimates of 20,000 birds or more meant that even if the soldiers achieved their target of 1,000 kills, 19,000 birds remained. It was like trying to drain an ocean with a teaspoon. The emus were a migrating tide. They came in waves, driven by the search for food and water. Killing a few hundred birds did not stop the tide. It barely registered. The idea that a quick, decisive military operation could solve a deep-seated ecological problem proved laughably wrong. The military learned that a conventional solution was the wrong fit. You cannot bomb or shoot away a natural migration pattern. You cannot deter instinct with bullets. The conflict highlighted the mismatch between human tools and nature's processes. The machine gun, a tool of rapid destruction against a massed foe, became an emblem of human futility when pointed at a scattered, elusive biological force. The army was a hammer. The emu problem was not a nail. So if you cannot declare war on nature, what do you do? This brings us to the second, more practical lesson. Bring a bigger net. This net was not made of twine and rope. It was a metaphor for a different kind of strategy, a more appropriate tool for the job. This tool was the bounty system. The bounty system worked because it aligned human incentive with the natural behavior of the birds and the local knowledge of the people. It acknowledged the problem as an ongoing, dispersed struggle, not a single, decisive battle. Farmers, facing ruin, now had a direct financial incentive to protect their crops. A shilling for each emu killed meant that every bird removed from their land brought a small, tangible reward. The bounty system decentralized the effort. Instead of 3 soldiers with 2 machine guns, thousands of farmers and local shooters, each with their own understanding of the land and their own civilian weapons, became the hunters. This created a widespread, continuous pressure on the emu population in the affected areas. There was no single front line. Every farm, every field became a potential hunting ground. This distributed effort was the true bigger net. It cast a wide, continuous sweep over the landscape. The hunters under the bounty system often used tactics that soldiers could not. They set up simple traps near water sources. They learned to drive the emus into fence lines where they could be more easily shot. They understood the wind, the sun, and the emus' patterns of movement in a way that uniformed soldiers, dropped into an unfamiliar environment, never could. They moved silently, patiently, blending into the landscape rather than making a grand, noisy assault. The lesson was not about superior firepower. It was about appropriate strategy. It was about understanding the enemy. The emus were not an army to be defeated in open combat. They were a biological population to be managed. The machine guns were blunt instruments. The bounty system, with its individualized hunting, was a finer, more precise tool. It was not a victory in the military sense, but a practical, if brutal, method of coexisting with a dominant native species in a shared, contested landscape. The Emu War became a vivid case study in the perils of human arrogance. It showed that sometimes the most advanced technology is useless without a fundamental understanding of the problem. You cannot force nature to conform to your rules. Instead, you must adapt your methods to nature's reality. The bigger net was not about more power, but about smarter, more localized and more persistent effort. It was a lesson hard won, paid for in wasted ammunition, bruised egos, and international embarrassment. But it was a lesson that stuck, a stark reminder that some battles are best fought, not with declarations of war, but with patience, adaptation, and the right tool for the job. The military operation ended. The soldiers packed their gear. The trucks rumbled away. The emus, the unlikely victors, continued their ancient migrations. For Australia, the Great Emu War became more than just a failed pest control exercise. It cemented itself in the nation's folklore, a peculiar, enduring emblem of human hubris colliding with the unyielding force of nature. This conflict, born of what seemed like a logical solution, using military might against a destructive pest, unfolded into a globally recognized farce. Its historical significance lies precisely in its absurdity, a timeless reminder that sometimes the dumbest ideas make the best stories. Why was it a dumb idea? From a purely military standpoint, the plan ignored fundamental principles of engagement. Soldiers trained for human adversaries, for trench warfare, for strategic objectives against thinking opponents. Emus were none of these things. They had no command structure, no supply lines, no strategic goals beyond eating and surviving. Deploying Lewis automatic machine guns, weapons designed for rapid, sustained fire against a massed human enemy, against dispersed, fast-moving, and often individually resilient birds, was a profound miscalculation. The sheer inefficiency of firepower became immediately apparent. Each bullet represented a cost in resources, manufacturing, transport. Each missed shot represented wasted effort. The military's initial assessment failed to account for the birds' biological attributes, their speed, their erratic movements, their physical toughness. Consider the logical flow that led to the deployment. Farmers have a problem. The problem involves large numbers of animals. The military has weapons designed for large numbers. Therefore, the military can solve the problem. This chain of reasoning, simple and seemingly sound on the surface, ignored all the critical nuances. It was a classic case of applying a tool to a problem for which it was utterly unsuited. The soldiers were not pest controllers. Their doctrine did not include avian warfare. Their training focused on disciplined engagements, not wild chases across dusty plains after unpredictable birds. This fundamental strategic error is why the Emu War lives on as a textbook example of a military blunder. The media played a significant role in cementing the story's historical place. When reports of the military struggling against birds began to leak out, newspapers around the world seized upon the narrative. It was irresistible. Imagine the headlines: Australian Army battles emus, loses ground. Feathered foes outwit machine guns. Journalists, hungry for novel stories, found a goldmine in the sheer incongruity of the situation. They played up the comedic angle, highlighting the absurdity of a powerful modern military being confounded by flightless birds. Cartoons appeared in satirical publications, depicting helmeted soldiers fleeing from giant grinning emus or firing wildly into empty skies. These images, designed to provoke laughter and gentle mockery, stuck in the public imagination. The Emu War became a symbol of human arrogance versus natural resilience. It was David versus Goliath, but with Goliath being a fully equipped army and David being a flock of birds. The fact that the birds, driven only by instinct, emerged victorious, made the story even more compelling. It resonated with a public that often felt detached from the grand narratives of military power. Here was a humble, relatable failure. The event became a cautionary tale long after the last bullet was fired. It served as a stark reminder of the limits of human control over the natural world. Australia, a continent with a unique and often challenging environment, has a long history of dealing with pest animals. The Emu War showed that a heavy-handed, technologically reliant approach was not always the answer. It demonstrated that understanding the biology and ecology of the adversary was far more important than raw destructive power. This lesson informed future pest control strategies, pushing for more integrated, long-term solutions like the bounty system, which relied on sustained, localized effort rather than dramatic, short-term military intervention. It also became a peculiar touchstone in discussions about unconventional warfare. While the Emu War was certainly not a war in any conventional sense, it highlighted the challenges of facing an adversary that does not conform to expected patterns. The emus fought with evasion, with numbers, with sheer persistence. They did not engage directly. They did not have weaknesses that could be exploited by military tactics. This forced a re-evaluation of how resources should be deployed against non-traditional threats, even if those threats were feathered and lacked any discernible intelligence. The enduring appeal of the Emu War lies in its inherent irony. Australia, a nation forged through tough environments and military valor, faced a peculiar humiliation. The story is simple. A powerful human force tried to dominate a simple natural force and failed. This narrative arc is universally understood. It speaks to the hubris that often accompanies technological advancement and human ambition. It is a story told to new generations, not to mock the soldiers, but to highlight a moment of collective misjudgment, a time when a nation learned a humbling lesson from its own backyard. Consider its place in global historical anecdotes. When people recount strange or absurd moments in history, the Emu War often comes up. It stands alongside other instances where human plans went spectacularly awry. It is memorable because it is so unexpected. You might expect a war between nations or a conflict over resources. You do not expect a government to declare war on birds and then lose. This unexpected twist makes it a perfect narrative, easy to retell, and always guaranteed to elicit a reaction. Its very absurdity makes it stick in the mind. The failure also forced a re-evaluation of the relationship between human settlement and native wildlife in Australia. The soldier settlers were attempting to establish agriculture in an environment that was naturally home to vast populations of emus. The conflict highlighted the ecological tensions inherent in such endeavors. It showed that simply pushing back nature with force often leads to unexpected and frustrating outcomes. The Emu War became a vivid example of ecological conflict, a microcosm of the larger struggles between human development and environmental preservation. It underscored the fact that solutions often require compromise, adaptation, and a deeper understanding of natural systems rather than brute force. So the historical significance of the Great Emu War is multifaceted. It is a lesson in military strategy, a case study in media narrative, a cautionary tale about human interaction with nature, and a prime example of historical irony. Its absurdity makes it memorable. Its simplicity makes it universally understood. And its outcome, a defeat for a modern army by a flock of flightless birds, ensures its place as a timeless story, forever reminding us that sometimes the dumbest ideas, those born of overconfidence and misjudgment, make for the most compelling and enduring tales.